Okay, so today we're talking about imaginary numbers. So we're simplifying radicals using imaginary numbers. So let's just do a quick review on what radicals are, okay? So you have like a radical of 9. So that means that, there's that little imaginary 2. That means you need to break the 9 into two numbers. And I know that's 3 and 3, right? So basically, radical 9 is radical 3 times 3. So I found that number. So it's just 3. So the radical symbol means I am just breaking that number into two things that multiply to be that original number. That makes sense. So radical 25 obviously is going to come out to be 5, right? And radical 49 is, 7 and so on. Okay, now what happens if you have radical of a negative 9? Okay, so how do I break negative 9 into two numbers? That gives me back original of negative 9. So because I have 3 times 3, which is positive 9, and I can try negative 3 times negative 3, because they both have to be the same number, that also gives me a positive 9. So ultimately, there is no way that I can find two numbers that multiply each other to give me negative 9, right? The same number multiplied to give you negative 9. You can't do that. So what we have is the idea of an imaginary number, a number that doesn't exist in the real plane. It's in the imaginary plane. So what we call that is I. Okay, I for imaginary, and I stands for the radical of negative 1. And what does that mean? Well, it means nothing in the real numbers. Okay, it does not exist in the real numbers, but we use it kind of like a placeholder for when you deal with radical of negative numbers. Okay, so let's just take it as it is, I as the radical of negative 1. And we're going to go through and let's see what I squared is. Okay, I squared is radical of negative 1 times radical of negative 1, which gives you negative 1, right? Because two of the same numbers under the radical gives you that number. So, and then we can go on to I cube. What does that give us? Right? I cube is I squared times I, right? But I squared is negative 1, because we found that here, times I, which gives you negative I. And then I to the fourth is just I squared times I squared. And we found I squared to be negative 1. So negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. So it's kind of like a progression, right? I is radical negative 1. I squared is negative 1. Okay. So you guys kind of have to remember these. These are kind of facts that you will memorize, basically. And then we go on, but don't worry, there aren't any more. It kind of repeats, because I to the fifth is now I to the fourth times I. And I to the fourth is just 1 times I, which is just I. So I to the fifth is I. So you start back at the beginning. Right? I to the fifth is I, which is radical negative 1. And you go I to the sixth, which is I to the fifth times I, which is I to the fifth is I times I, which is I squared, which is negative 1. So, whoops, negative 1. So it starts back over again. It starts from the beginning. So every time you go down 4 power, it starts over. So I to the fifth is same as I. I to the sixth is same as I to the second. I to the seventh is the same as I cubed. And I to the eighth is the same as I to the fourth. Okay, so this is just kind of like this little novel idea that you have to remember what the powers of I are. At our level, it's not very important, it's not very useful, but it's something that we do need to know. Okay, but when is it useful? It's useful when you have to simplify, like we said, radical of negative 9. How do we simplify that? Well, that gives me radical of negative 1 times 9. All right. That gives me radical of negative 1 times radical 9. Okay? And radical of negative 1 is I. And radical 9, I can do that now. It's positive, which is 3. So in the end, I have 3I. Okay? So basically, if you have a negative under the radical, that's an I. Okay? I'm going to do a couple more examples, but I think you guys get the idea. So radical of negative 49. Same thing. I have radical of negative 49 is radical negative 1 times 49, which I can split that up to radical 49 times radical negative 1, which radical 49 is 7. Radical of negative 1 is I. So I have 7I. Last one, and I think we can be done with this, right? So I have radical of 27. Oh, negative 27, of course. So that gives me radical of 27 times radical of negative 1. So this gives me 3 radical 3I. And that would be your final answer.